the Trinity and the Valley of Fire. In the valley called Hinnom, south of Jerusalem, there once stood altars where children were passed through fire to a god named Molech, and the priests who stopped the practice were themselves descendants of the same royal line that had built those altars 3 generations earlier. The drums beat day and night, not for ceremony, but to drown out what could not be allowed into the hearing of those waiting outside stone walls. The smoke rose in a column that could be seen from the eastern gate of the Temple Mount itself, where another god was worshipped, the god who would later be described, impossibly, as one being in 3 persons. The practice ended, the valley remained, and the word for that place, Gehenna, became in the mouth of a carpenter from Nazareth the name for the only fire that does not end. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how the same pattern that destroyed that valley explains the doctrine every Christian civilization has died trying to understand. Friends, let's take a breath. No one here claims complete knowledge of the truth. Your thoughts matter. Write in the comments where you're from and what you do. It brings the picture to life. If this is interesting, support with a like and subscribe. Now, let's continue. The Kingdom of Judah in the 8th century before the Common Era was not a superpower. At its height under King David and Solomon, the United Monarchy had controlled perhaps 60,000 square kilometers. By the time Ahaz took the throne in 735, the northern kingdom of Israel had already split away, and Judah itself was a narrow strip of highland barely 50 kilometers wide, trapped between Egypt to the south and the rising terror of Assyria to the northeast. The Assyrian war machine under Tiglath-Pileser III had already swallowed Damascus. The deportation protocols were efficient. 27,000 taken from one city, 46 towns emptied, populations relocated across the empire so that no rebellion could ever reconstitute along tribal lines. Jerusalem was small, its walls enclosed perhaps 15,000 people. The temple Solomon had built was not ancient yet, barely 2 centuries old, but already it was the one unifying symbol of a people who had spent more time conquered than free. Ahaz was 20 years old when he took the throne. His father, Jotham, had maintained independence through tribute and silence. Ahaz inherited a kingdom that was about to be torn apart from the north. Israel and Syria formed an alliance and demanded Judah join them in rebellion against Assyria. Ahaz refused. Israel and Syria invaded. The Chronicles say they killed 120,000 of Judah's soldiers in a single day and took 200,000 captives back to Samaria. The northern kingdom of Israel, brothers, same blood, same language, was slaughtering Judah because Ahaz would not rebel against the empire that would soon erase Israel from existence. The irony was surgical. Ahaz did what seemed rational. He emptied the temple treasury and sent it north to Tiglath-Pileser with a message that has survived in Assyrian records. I am your servant and your son. Assyria crushed the Israel-Syria coalition. Judah was spared. But Ahaz had invited the destroyer into his house. There is a detail buried in the sources that most people miss entirely. When Ahaz traveled north to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser and offer formal submission, he saw an altar. The text in 2 Kings chapter 16 describes it in exact dimensions. Ahaz sent a sketch and full measurement to Urijah the priest in Jerusalem and ordered an identical copy built and installed in the temple courtyard, displacing the bronze altar that had stood there since Solomon. This was not cultural exchange. It was theological capitulation. The God represented by that altar was being given place in the house of Yahweh, not as a guest, but as a superior. The same king who had emptied the temple to buy protection now retrofitted the temple to honor the iconography of the empire he served. And then, because he had learned the efficiency of fire, he built altars in the valley of Hinnom and began the practice that gives that valley its eternal weight in history. The Valley of Hinnom is not metaphor. It curves along the southern and western edges of the old city of Jerusalem. Today it is a public park. In the 8th century, it was the place where Ahaz and then his successors practiced what the text calls passing children through the fire to Molech. The exact mechanism is debated by scholars who prefer ambiguity to horror. The text is not ambiguous. Children were burned. The Hebrew uses the word ba'esh, in the fire, not near it. Some sources suggest they were placed in the heated bronze arms of a statue. Others suggest open pits. The drums were constant because the sound of what was happening could not be allowed to carry into the city above. This was not isolated. This was policy. The king himself participated. The valley became the national altar of a people who had been given one law above all others: no other gods and no sacrifice of children. Ahaz broke both in the same fire. Ahaz did not know that in 3 generations, this valley would become the verbal icon of eternal judgment, spoken by the mouth of God incarnate. He did not know that the Word made flesh would stand on the hills above that valley and use its name, Gehenna, to describe the fire that does not go out, where the worm does not die. He could not have known, but what he planted in that valley did not die with him.
His son Hezekiah became king and did what his father should have done.
He smashed the altars, cut down the Asherah poles, and broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, because the people had begun burning incense to it. He purged the high places. He tore down the altar his father had installed in the temple. He defiled the valley of Hinnom so that no one could use it again for the purpose it had served. The reform was total. For 1 generation the sickness seemed cured. But what Ahaz had legitimized, the presence of foreign gods in the architecture of the nation's worship, did not die when the physical structures were destroyed. It had become ideologically permissible. The door had been opened. Closing it once did not change the fact that it could be opened again. The pattern must be named. A leader under existential threat makes a compromise that seems politically rational, introducing into the sacred system an element that appears controllable, but is definitionally corrosive. He dies. His son purges it. The purge works. But the seed has been planted in the collective memory that this compromise is an option. The son of the purger grows up in peace, having never faced the existential threat that justified the compromise in the first place. And when pressure returns, different in form but identical in structure, the compromise is chosen again, because the precedent exists. Hezekiah's son Manasseh took the throne at 12 years old. He reigned 55 years, longer than any king of Judah. The text says he rebuilt the high places his father had destroyed, erected altars to Baal, made an Asherah pole, and worshipped the starry hosts. He built altars to foreign gods inside the temple itself, in both courtyards. And he reinstated the valley of Hinnom, passing his own son through the fire. The valley that Hezekiah had defiled was reconsecrated to Molech under Manasseh's reign. The practice that had been surgically excised 1 generation prior returned at civilizational scale. This was not backsliding. This was state-sponsored theological inversion. The same priesthood that served Yahweh was now administering the altar system of Baal inside the courts of the temple. The Bible gives a single editorial sentence that lands like a gravestone. Manasseh led Judah and the people of Jerusalem astray, so that they did more evil than the nations the Lord had destroyed before the Israelites. The people who had been given the law were now outpacing in corruption the Canaanites who had been judged for the same acts. It seemed the limit of horror had been reached, but the real blow had not yet been struck. The irony deepens when the scale is understood. The Assyrian Empire that Ahaz had submitted to was now under Manasseh beginning to fracture. Egypt was rising again. Babylon was preparing its claim. Judah under Manasseh had 55 years to prepare, to fortify, to return to the covenantal terms that had been the explicit foundation of the kingdom's existence. Instead, those 55 years were used to institutionalize the very practices that the covenant forbade, embedding them so deeply into the religious infrastructure of the state that by the time Manasseh died, there was no living memory of a Judah that had not worshipped foreign gods inside its own temple. The generation that remembered Hezekiah's reform had died. The generation raised under Manasseh assumed that altars to Baal in the temple courtyard were normal, that passing children through fire in the valley of Hinnom was regrettable but occasionally necessary, that the starry hosts deserved some veneration alongside Yahweh. This was the achieved state when Josiah took the throne. Josiah was 8 years old. His father Ehrman had reigned 2 years before being assassinated by his own officials. The text gives Josiah one of the rare, unqualified commendations in the Chronicles. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and followed completely the ways of his father David, not turning aside to the right or to the left. In the 18th year of his reign, while repairing the temple, the high priest Hilkiah found a scroll. Not the scroll, a scroll. The book of the law had been lost inside the temple itself. The priests had been conducting sacrifices in a building that contained written instructions they had not read in decades. When the scroll was read to Josiah, he tore his robes. The text records his response. Great is the Lord's anger that burns against us, because those who have gone before us have not obeyed the word of this book. A prophetess named Huldah was consulted. Her verdict was final. The anger cannot be turned back, but because Josiah's heart was responsive, the disaster would not come in his lifetime. Josiah's reform was more thorough than Hezekiah's. He removed the Asherah pole from the temple and burned it in the Kidron Valley. He tore down the quarters of the male shrine prostitutes that were inside the temple complex. He desecrated the high places from Geba to Beersheba. And then, he did what Hezekiah had not. He desecrated Topheth in the valley of Hinnom, so that no one could use it to sacrifice children to Molech ever again. He dug up the bones of the priests who had served at the illegal altars and burned them on those same altars, defiling the sites generationally. He slaughtered the priests of the high places on their own altars. The reform was complete. The valley was ended as a cultic site. It was over. But the prophetess had already said the anger would not be turned back. Josiah's reform stopped the practice. It did not erase the guilt. 13 years after the scroll was found, Josiah died in battle at Megiddo, trying to intercept an Egyptian army. He was 39 years old.
His son Jehoahaz reigned 3 months before being deposed by Egypt.
His second son, Jehoiakim, was installed as a puppet king and immediately reinstated the policies Josiah had torn down. The valley was not reopened for child sacrifice. That particular practice had become internationally scandalous, but the altars to foreign gods returned, the Asherah poles were replanted, and the theological compromise that Ahaz had introduced 5 generations earlier was now permanent, immune to reform. When Babylon finally came in 586, destroyed the temple, and took the population into exile, the prophets did not present it as military defeat. They presented it as divorce. God had left the building. The glory departed. The same temple Ahaz had retrofitted with a foreign altar was now a pile of scorched stones. The valley that had consumed children in fire was now part of a city that had itself been consumed. The root appeared to be dead. It was not. 6 centuries later, a man named Joshua, anglicized later as Jesus, stood on the hills overlooking that same valley and used its name as shorthand for the final judgment. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, he says it is better to lose an eye than for the whole body to be thrown into Gehenna. In chapter 10, he says, "Do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear the one who can destroy both soul and body in Gehenna." He uses the word 12 times across the Gospel accounts. Every time, the word is Gehenna, not Hades, not Sheol, but the name of that valley. The valley where kings of Judah burned their children had become, in the mouth of God, the name for the fire that does not end. The metaphor was not decorative, it was medical. The same compromise that destroyed Judah was now being named as the pattern of ultimate destruction. And then, without explaining why it was necessary, he began teaching that God is one being in 3 persons. This is the hinge. The Trinity is not a riddle invented by councils. It is the answer to the question Judah could not solve. How do you remove corruption from the worship system when the corruption is inside the one doing the worshiping? Ahaz introduced foreign gods into the temple because he was afraid. His fear was not irrational. The armies were real. The threat was existential. But fear made him believe that a foreign altar in the temple courtyard was a containable compromise, that the presence of another god in proximity to Yahweh was theologically neutral, as long as Yahweh remained primary. He was wrong. The introduction of the altar legitimized the category of other gods who may be petitioned when Yahweh seems insufficient. Once that category exists, it does not matter how many reforms purge the physical structures. The category remains available in the architecture of thought. Hezekiah destroyed the altars. Manasseh rebuilt them. Josiah destroyed them again. Jehoiakim restored them. The cycle was not breaking because the cycle was not a result of insufficient zeal in destroying altars. It was a result of the belief that something other than God could be added to God to make worship more effective. The Trinity does not solve this by addition. It solves it by revealing that God has never been alone. The Father, Son, and Spirit are not 3 gods assisting one another. They are one God in eternal relationship, complete before creation, requiring nothing, inviting everything. Worship directed to the Father through the Son and the Spirit is not worship enhanced by adding helpers. It is worship directed to the one God who is already eternally 3 persons in perfect union. The category other gods who might help is not forbidden because God is insecure. It is forbidden because it is definitionally incoherent. There are no other gods. There is one God, and that God is Trinity. Ahaz did not understand this because the revelation was not yet complete, but the pattern was already visible. The moment a nation believes that worship of the true God can be supplemented with worship of another power, political, ideological, spiritual, the nation has introduced into its center the seed of its own destruction. Not because God is offended in the emotional sense, but because the logic of supplement is the logic of disintegration. A thing that requires supplement is insufficient. A God that requires supplement is not God. And a people who worship a God they believe is insufficient will eventually abandon that God entirely, or reconstitute that God in terms defined by the supplement. This is what happened in the Valley of Hinnom. The altar Ahaz built was not an altar to Molech instead of Yahweh. It was an altar to Molech in addition to Yahweh, activated when Yahweh's protection seemed inadequate. But once the altar existed, the distinction between in addition to and instead of collapsed across 3 generations. By the time Manasseh reigned, Baal had altars inside the temple itself. The supplement had become the center. The thing added to enhance worship had replaced the worship it was meant to enhance. The Trinity is the theological answer to this pattern because it reveals that the one God has never needed enhancement. The Father sends the Son. The Son accomplishes the will of the Father. The Spirit applies the work of the Son. This is not cooperation between separate deities. This is the internal life of the one God, now revealed and made available to creatures through incarnation. The Son does not supplement the Father. The Spirit does not add power the Son lacked. They are the one God in perfect, eternal, self-sufficient communion. Worship directed to this God cannot be supplemented because this God is already complete. The Valley of Hinnom is still there. It is called Wadi Rababi in Arabic.
The southeastern section, near the confluence with the Kidron Valley, is known in Hebrew as Gei Ben Hinnom, the Valley of the Son of Hinnom. That name, contracted and transliterated through Greek, became Gehenna. The valley itself is quiet now. There are no drums. There are no altars. The archaeology of child sacrifice has been found elsewhere in Canaanite sites, confirming that the practice was real, widespread, and exactly as horrific as the text describes. In the valley itself, you will not find the altars Ahaz built. Josiah's desecration was thorough, but the name remains. And the name carries the entire weight of the pattern. The question is not why God is 3 persons. The question is why a people given direct communication with the one true God would still burn their children to other gods in a valley within sight of the temple. The answer is that knowledge of God is not the same as trust in God, and trust in God is not the same as worship of God alone. Ahaz knew Yahweh existed. He did not trust that Yahweh was sufficient, so he added. Hezekiah trusted and removed. Manasseh knew the history and added anyway. Josiah trusted and removed again. Jehoiakim knew the reforms had failed twice and added again, because the pattern of addition was now embedded in the muscle memory of the nation's worship. The Trinity breaks this cycle not by explaining God more clearly, but by revealing that God is already in himself the fullness that the supplements were pretending to provide. The Father's love does not need a mediating God to reach humanity. The Father sends his own Son. The Son's work does not need an external spirit to apply it. The Son and the Father send the Spirit who is equally God. The Spirit does not point to a God beyond himself. The Spirit glorifies the Son and leads people to the Father, who is the same God the Spirit is. The circle is closed. The addition is impossible. Not because God forbids it out of jealousy, but because God is already complete, and what is complete cannot be supplemented without being destroyed. This is why every Christian creed that has survived begins with the Trinity, not because it is the easiest doctrine, because it is the immune system. The moment a church, a denomination, a movement, or a person begins to believe that Jesus is a great teacher but not God, or that the Spirit is a force but not a person, or that the Father is the real God, and the Son and Spirit are subordinate helpers, that entity has reintroduced the altar in the courtyard. The names change, the structure is identical. Something is being added to God to make God sufficient, and the thing being added will, within 3 generations, replace the God it was meant to assist. The councils that formulated the doctrine of the Trinity in the 4th and 5th centuries
were not inventing new ideas. They were erecting walls around the pattern that had already destroyed Judah. The Arians said the sun was the first and greatest creation, not God himself. The Nicene response was not philosophical pedantry. It was triage. If the sun is a creature, then worship of the sun is worship of something other than God, and the door Ahaz opened to open again. The Pneumatomachians said the spirit is a force or an angel, not God himself. The response at Constantinople in 381 was the same. If the spirit is not God, then dependence on the spirit is dependence on a supplement, and the cycle begins again. The councils were not speculating. They were building walls around Gehenna. The doctrine is difficult because the reality is difficult. One being, three persons. Not one person with three modes. Not three gods in alliance. One God, eternally three. Undivided in essence, distinct in personhood. The Father is not the Son. The Son is not the Spirit. The Spirit is not the Father. Yet there are not three gods. There is one.
The language strains because it is describing something that exists beyond the categories of created being, yet must be described in the language of created being, because that is the only language creatures have. But the difficulty is not arbitrary. The difficulty protects the truth. If Trinity were easy to explain, it would be easy to reduce. And the moment it is reduced, the altar is back. Manasseh did not wake up one morning and decide to burn children. He inherited a kingdom that had survived by compromise, and he assumed the compromise was wisdom. His grandfather Ahaz had bought survival by submission to Assyria and supplementation of worship. It worked. Judah survived. His father Hezekiah had purged the supplements and trusted God alone. It also worked. Judah survived. Manasseh looked at both models and chose the one that seemed more controllable. Trusting God alone requires faith that the outcome will be acceptable, even if the method is invisible. Supplementing God with political calculation and theological flexibility provides the illusion that the outcome can be managed. Manasseh chose manageability. And because the precedent existed, because Ahaz had proven that a foreign altar in the temple courtyard was survivable, Manasseh did not see himself as an innovator. He saw himself as a realist. The same logic governs every theological compromise in every generation. A church begins with a clear confession. God is Trinity. Scripture is authoritative. Christ is Lord. The gospel is the power of God for salvation. Then pressure comes. Cultural, financial, intellectual, emotional. The pressure is real. The threat feels existential. And a voice suggests that the confession can be slightly adjusted, not abandoned but supplemented, enhanced with language that makes it more palatable, more inclusive, more intellectually credible, more emotionally accessible. The adjustment is small. The altar is not replacing the temple, it is just being added to the courtyard. And because the adjustment works, because the pressure decreases, because the church survives, because growth or funding or respect returns, the adjustment is remembered not as compromise, but as wisdom. One generation later, the adjustment is assumed. The next pressure comes, and another adjustment is made, slightly larger because the precedent exists. 3 generations later, the original confession is unrecognizable, and the entity that bears the church's name is worshiping gods the founders would have died resisting. The pattern is not unique to liberal denominations. Conservative movements do it with nationalism, politics, culture war alliances, celebrity leadership, or theological systems that become more authoritative than Scripture itself. The content changes, the pattern does not. Something is added to God to make God effective in the current crisis. The addition is defended as tactical. It becomes structural. Within 3 generations, it is the center. The Valley of Hinnom is the standing proof that this pattern is not metaphorical. It is historical, repeatable, and lethal. The Trinity is the answer because the Trinity reveals that God is not a single isolated monarch who might need advisors, allies, or supplements. God is eternal relationship, Father, Son, Spirit, complete in himself, infinite in love, requiring nothing, offering everything. Worship of this God cannot be supplemented because this God is already the fullness of everything worship seeks. Security does not come from adding political alliances to faith in God. It comes from trusting that the God who is Trinity is sufficient.
Meaning does not come from adding cultural relevance to the gospel. It comes from the gospel, which is the revelation of the triune God's action in history. Power does not come from adding emotional experience to the work of the Spirit. Spirit is God, and his work is already power. The moment this is understood, the question changes. The question is no longer, how can we make worship of God more effective? The question becomes, why would we insult the triune God by implying that his fullness requires our addition? And that question burns like fire through every compromise, every supplement, every altar built in the courtyard. Josiah's reform failed not because it was insufficient, but because it was surgical and not generational. He destroyed the altars, he killed the priests, he desecrated the valley, but he did not, because he could not, destroy the memory that the altars had once been there and had seemed to work. The generation that rebuilt the altars after his death was not rebelling against a truth they had never heard. They were returning to a pattern their grandparents had used successfully. The reform had removed the structures, but not the logic. And logic, once embedded, does not die when the man who opposed it dies. The Trinity is the generational answer because it does not destroy the structures and hope the next generation remembers. It destroys the logic. There is no other God. There are no supplements. The one God is already three persons in perfect unity, and that is the only God there is. Worship directed anywhere else is not worship directed at a lesser helper. It is worship directed at nothing, at demons, at projections of human fear and desire. The category, other gods who might assist, is not forbidden because it is dangerous. It is forbidden because it is incoherent. There is one God. That God is Father, Son, and Spirit. And outside that Trinity, there is no deity to petition, no power to add, no security to negotiate. This is why the early Christians died rather than burn incense to Caesar. It was not incense. It was an altar in the courtyard. And they had read what happened in the Valley of Hinnom when the altar in the courtyard was tolerated. The valley itself teaches this without words. Walk through it today, and you will see gardens, footpaths, the quiet traffic of a city park. No monument marks where Josiah desecrated Topheth. The archaeology gives coordinates, but does not build museums. The site is liturgically silent, and this silence is itself a statement. The place where kings believed they could negotiate with gods other than Yahweh by offering what was most precious is now a place where no negotiation happens, where no God is petitioned, where the memory of what happened has been compressed into a single word that means unending fire. The word Gehenna appears 12 times in the New Testament. Each time it is spoken by Jesus, except once when James uses it to describe the tongue set on fire by hell itself. The distribution is not accidental. Jesus uses it in contexts of judgment, warning, finality. He uses it to describe the destination of those who cause children to stumble, those who refuse to cut off the hand or gouge out the eye that causes sin, those who call their brother a fool in anger, those who refuse forgiveness. The pattern is exact. Gehenna is the consequence for those who treat as negotiable what is not. The Pharisees who strain out gnats and swallow camels, who tithe mint and dill and cumin but neglect justice and mercy, who travel over land and sea to make a single convert and then make that convert twice as much a son of hell as themselves. These are not people who deny God. They are people who have supplemented God with systems they control, and the supplement has become the center. Jesus does not explain the Trinity to them in systematic terms. He demonstrates it. He says, I and the Father are one. He says, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. He says, I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper, the Spirit of truth. He prays to the Father. He sends the Spirit. He claims the authority to forgive sins, which only God can do, and then proves it by healing the paralytic, which only power can do. He accepts worship. He speaks of himself as existing before Abraham. He says the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, and then he goes to a cross, dies, rises, and ascends, having accomplished what no supplement could accomplish, the removal of the guilt that reforms could not touch. This is the surgical correction. Josiah could desecrate the valley, but he could not erase the guilt of what had happened there. The blood cried out from the ground, and no ritual purification addressed it. The law given at Sinai was clear: no sacrifice for intentional high-handed sin against the covenant. Child sacrifice was not accidental. It was policy. The guilt was corporate, generational, and beyond the mechanism of atonement provided in the Levitical system. The prophets knew this. Jeremiah said the days were coming when God would make a new covenant, not like the one made with their ancestors, because that covenant had been broken beyond repair. Ezekiel saw the glory of God leave the temple before the Babylonians arrived. The departure was not the result of the destruction, it was the cause. God left, and then the city fell, because the city had already fallen internally by believing that the presence of God could be supplemented with the presence of other gods, and the outcome would remain stable. The Trinity is not supplementation, it is revelation. The Father did not send a prophet or an angel to fix what was broken. He sent his Son, not a separate being enlisted to help, but the second person of the Trinity, eternally God, now incarnate. The Son did not negotiate with the guilt. He bore it, took it into his own body on the cross, died under its weight, rose, proving that the death was sufficient.
And then sent the Spirit, not as a force or a divine energy, but as the third person of the Trinity, to apply the work of the Son to everyone who believes. This is the structure that makes atonement coherent. If the Son is not God, then his death is the death of a creature, and a creature's death cannot atone for sin against the infinite God. If the Spirit is not God, then the application of the Son's work is the work of a created intermediary, and the believer is trusting a supplement, not God himself. But if the Son is God incarnate, then his death is the death of God in human nature, infinite in value, sufficient for all sin. And if the Spirit is God, then his application of that work is God himself dwelling in the believer, not a lesser force, but the fullness of the triune God taking residence in the human heart. The early church did not articulate this immediately in the language of Nicaea, but they knew it structurally. Paul writes in Romans chapter 8, "The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children." Not a spirit, the Spirit himself testifying. The same chapter says the Spirit intercedes for believers with groans that words cannot express. Intercession is personal action. Only persons intercede. And if the Spirit is interceding, he is not a force, he is a person. And if he is God's Spirit, dwelling in believers, applying the work of the Son, testifying to adoption by the Father, then the Spirit is not a messenger from God, he is God. The same structure appears in John chapter 14 through 16. Jesus tells the disciples he will send the Helper, the Spirit of truth, who proceeds from the Father, who will testify about the Son, who will convict the world concerning sin and righteousness and judgment, who will guide believers into all truth, who will not speak on his own authority but will speak what he hears, who will glorify the Son. This is not delegation. This is the internal action of the triune God now being revealed to creatures in language creatures can process. The Father sends the Son accomplishes the work. The Father and Son send the Spirit applies the work and glorifies the Son. And through the Spirit, believers are brought to the Son, and through the Son, believers are brought to the Father. The circle is complete, and nothing outside the Trinity is needed to complete it. Ahaz built an altar in the courtyard because he believed Yahweh needed the assistance of the Assyrian god to guarantee security. The theology was implicit but clear. One God is not enough when the threat is existential. Jesus reveals that the one God is already, eternally, three persons in perfect unity, and that this triune God is not only sufficient, but is the only source of the security, forgiveness, and transformation that the supplements pretended to offer. The altar in the courtyard was never assistance. It was replacement, and the son who removed it, and the grandson restored it, and the great-grandson who removed it again, and the great-great-grandson who restored it again, were all trapped in a cycle that could not be broken by human reform, because the cycle was not a result of insufficient knowledge. It was a result of insufficient trust in the sufficiency of God. The Trinity does not make trust easier, it makes trust rational. If God is a single isolated monad, transcendent and distant, then trust requires hoping that this distant God will notice and care and act. That hope is vulnerable to doubt under pressure, and doubt under pressure makes the altar in the courtyard seem reasonable. But if God is Trinity, if the Father loves the Son eternally, if the Son delights in the Father perfectly, if the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son in infinite communion, then trust is not hoping that a distant God will act. Trust is resting in the knowledge that the God who is already perfect relationship
has invited creatures into that relationship through incarnation, atonement, and indwelling. The invitation is not supplemental to God's being. It is the overflow of God's eternal love within the Trinity, now extended to creation. This is the answer to the Valley of Hinnom. The valley demanded children because the gods who were worshipped there were projections of human terror, requiring sacrifice to be appeased, negotiated with through violence. The triune God does not require appeasement. He accomplishes it. The Father sends the Son offers himself. The sacrifice is not from humanity to God, but from God to God on behalf of humanity. And the result is not negotiation, but adoption. Those who trust in the Son are brought into the eternal relationship of the Trinity, not as equals, not as gods themselves, but as children of the Father, brothers and sisters of the Son, temples of the Spirit. The relationship within the Trinity is now the context of the believer's existence. Manasseh spent 55 years embedding the altar in the courtyard so deeply that by the time he died, the memory of a Judah without foreign gods was extinct. The generation that rebuilt after him had no living connection to Hezekiah's reform. They knew the stories, but stories are not memory, and memory is not conviction. Josiah found the scroll and was horrified, but the horror was individual, not corporate. People complied with the reform because the king commanded it, not because they believed the gods Josiah was removing were false. When Josiah died, the compliance died with him, because compliance without conviction is performance, and performance ends when the director leaves the stage. The Trinity is the conviction, not the rule, not the command. The conviction that the one God is already complete, already perfect, already sufficient, and that every supplement is not assistance, but insult. This conviction does not come from argument. It comes from encounter. The disciples did not believe Jesus was God because he taught them the doctrine of the Trinity. They believed he was God because he forgave their sins, calmed storms with a word, rose from execution, and sent the Spirit at Pentecost in fire and wind and languages they had never learned. The theology came after, as the church tried to put into words what they had already encountered. God with us, God in us, God for us, and the God who is with and in and for is the same God who created the universe and will judge it at the end. The councils did not invent this. They protected it from the same pattern that destroyed Judah. Every heresy the councils rejected was a version of the altar in the courtyard. Arianism said the Son is the greatest creature, an altar. Sabellianism said the Father, Son, and Spirit are masks worn by one person, a different altar, but still an altar, because it denies the eternal relationship within God that makes atonement coherent. Nestorianism separated the two natures of Christ so far that the incarnation became cooperation between God and man, rather than the union of God and man, another altar. Eutychianism blended the natures so completely that Christ was neither God nor man, but a third thing, another altar. Every time the councils said no, not because they enjoyed conflict, because they had read about the Valley of Hinnom and knew where the altars lead. The valley leads to Babylon. Babylon leads to exile. Exile leads to silence. And silence under judgment is not peace. It is the waiting room of Gehenna. But exile did not end the people, and Gehenna is not the final word. The Trinity is. The return from Babylon happened under Cyrus, king of Persia, who issued a decree allowing the Jews to rebuild the temple. The first group returned under Zerubbabel in 538. The foundation was laid, and the old men who had seen Solomon's temple wept because the new one was smaller. The work stopped for 16 years. The prophets Haggai and Zechariah pushed the people to resume. The temple was finished in 516, 70 years after its destruction, exactly as Jeremiah had prophesied. But the glory did not return. No cloud filled the temple. No fire descended. The priests performed the sacrifices, but the presence that had filled Solomon's temple and departed before the Babylonians arrived did not come back. 400 years of silence followed. No prophet, no voice. The temple stood, the sacrifices continued, the law was read, but the heavens were quiet. The silence was not absence of sound, it was absence of word. God had spoken through Moses, through Samuel, through David, through Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel and the 12 minor prophets, and then nothing. The Greeks conquered. The Maccabees rebelled. The Romans arrived. The temple was expanded under Herod into one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world. And still, no word. And then, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, the word came. Not to the temple, to the wilderness. A man named John, son of Zechariah the priest, appeared in the desert wearing camel hair and eating locusts, baptizing in the Jordan River, and shouting that the kingdom of heaven was near. The people came. The Pharisees came. The soldiers came. And John said, I baptize you with water for repentance, but he who is coming after me is mightier than I, whose sandals I am not worthy to carry. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire. Fire. The word again. Not the fire of the valley of Hinnom, the fire of the Holy Spirit. The same Spirit who had hovered over the waters at creation, who had filled the tabernacle in the wilderness, who had filled Solomon's temple, who had departed before the exile, who had not returned when the second temple was built. That Spirit was coming again, and this time not to fill a building, but to fill people. Jesus came to John and was baptized. The heavens opened. The Spirit descended like a dove, and a voice from heaven said, This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. The Trinity revealed. The Father speaking, the Son standing in the water, the Spirit descending. Not three gods, one God. Not one person in three modes, three persons. The Father loves the Son obeys the Father, the Spirit rests on the Son. And the voice from heaven declares what has always been true. This is my beloved Son. The people hearing this did not immediately understand the doctrine, but they understood that something had shifted. The silence was over. The Word had returned. And the Word was not a prophet pointing to God. The Word was God Himself, incarnate, standing in the Jordan, about to begin the work that would end the need for the valley, the altar, the supplement, the compromise. Jesus' first recorded teaching after his baptism, according to Matthew, includes the Sermon on the Mount. And in that sermon, he uses the word Gehenna 3 times. He says, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into Gehenna. He says, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better to lose one part than for your whole body to go into Gehenna. The images are violent because the stakes are ultimate. The valley where children were burned to Molech is now the name for the final consequence of unrepentant sin. And Jesus, who is God incarnate, who will soon go to a cross to bear that consequence, is the one saying it. The irony is complete. The kings of Judah burned children in the valley to secure the favor of gods who did not exist. Jesus, the Son of the one true God, will be killed on a cross to secure the forgiveness of people who killed him. And the name of the valley where the false sacrifices happened is now the name he uses for the judgment those sacrifices could never prevent. But judgment is not the end of the story. Resurrection is. Jesus dies, the curtain in the temple tears from top to bottom, the earth quakes, the tombs open, he is buried, and on the third day he rises. Not resuscitated, resurrected. The same body but transformed, able to eat fish, able to be touched, but also able to appear in locked rooms, to vanish, to ascend. The resurrection is not proof of concept, it is the inauguration of new creation. The Son of God has taken human nature into himself, died in it, and raised it incorruptible. And because he is God, his human nature is now eternally united to divine nature in the second person of the Trinity. The incarnation is permanent. The Son of God is still, now, forever, human, not merely in memory, in reality. At the right hand of the Father, there is a human being, and that human being is God the Son. This is the answer to every altar in every courtyard in every generation. The supplement is not needed because God himself has become human, accomplished atonement, and risen to reign. And the Spirit he sends is not a force but a person, the third person of the Trinity, who dwells in everyone who believes and unites them to the Son, who brings them to the Father. The circle is closed. The need is met. The altar is gone, not because it was removed by reform, but because it was rendered obsolete by incarnation. 50 days after the resurrection, the Spirit comes at Pentecost. The sound of a violent wind fills the house. Tongues of fire rest on each person. They speak in languages they have never learned.
and the crowd outside hears them declaring the wonders of God in their own native tongues. Peter stands and preaches. He quotes the prophet Joel, "I will pour out my spirit on all flesh." The Spirit who filled the tabernacle, who filled Solomon's temple, who departed before the exile, has now come to fill not a building, but people. The temple is no longer a location, it is a body, the body of everyone who believes. And the presence of God, which the second temple never regained, is now inside the believers themselves, not as a reward for obedience, but as the source of it. This is the generational correction. Josiah's reform removed the altars. The Spirit's indwelling removes the desire for the altars. Not immediately, not without struggle. Paul will write to the Galatians, frustrated that they are returning to the weak and worthless elemental principles of the world after having received the Spirit. He will write to the Corinthians, confronting them for tolerating sexual immorality that even pagans would reject. The indwelling of the Spirit does not make believers sinless, but it makes them alive to God in a way that no reform could accomplish. The law could command, the Spirit enables. The law could condemn, the Spirit transforms. The law could identify the altar in the courtyard, the Spirit removes the desire to build it. And this is Trinitarian. The Father sends the Spirit. The Son purchases the right for the Spirit to indwell believers through his atoning death. The Spirit applies the work of the Son and unites believers to the Son, through whom they have access to the Father. Every step involves all three persons. The atonement is not the work of the Son alone. It is the work of the Trinity, the Father giving the Son offering himself, the Spirit empowering the incarnation and applying the atonement. Salvation is Trinitarian from start to finish, and any theology that reduces the Son or the Spirit to something less than God reduces salvation to something less than divine and reintroduces the logic of the supplement. The temple in Jerusalem stood for another 40 years after Pentecost. Sacrifices continued. Pilgrims came. The system that had been instituted at Sinai was still operating, even though the reality it foreshadowed had arrived. And then, in the year 70, Rome destroyed it. The general Titus besieged the city, breached the walls, and burned the temple. The destruction was total. The altar was gone. The priesthood was scattered. The sacrifices ended, and they have not resumed. For nearly 2,000 years there has been no temple, no altar, no sacrifice in Jerusalem, because the temple, the altar, and the sacrifice have all been fulfilled in Christ. The building was a shadow. The body of Christ is the reality, and the shadow, having served its purpose, was removed. The Valley of Hinnom remained. It became, according to some historical sources, the garbage dump of Jerusalem. The fires burned continuously, consuming the refuse of the city. Whether this was the case in the first century is debated by historians, but the image is structurally perfect. The place where kings burned children to false gods became the place where the city's waste was burned, a continuous fire consuming what was no longer needed. And Jesus had already used that image, the fire that does not go out, the worm that does not die, Gehenna, the final destination of everything that refuses the sufficiency of the triune God and builds altars to supplements. But even Gehenna is not the final image. The final image is the city that comes down from heaven. The book of Revelation, written by John on the island of Patmos, records a vision of the end, a new heaven and a new earth. The first heaven and the first earth have passed away. The sea is no more. And John sees the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. A loud voice from the throne says, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God." The temple is gone, not destroyed, rendered unnecessary. John writes, "I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God the Almighty and the Lamb." The Father and the Son are the temple. The building is not needed because the presence is direct. And the light of the city is not the sun or the moon, but the glory of God, and its lamp is the Lamb. The river of the water of life flows from the throne of God and of the Lamb. The tree of life grows on either side of the river, and its leaves are for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be anything accursed. The throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. They will see his face, and his name will be in their foreheads. This is the end of the pattern. The altar in the courtyard is gone. The valley of fire is behind.
The nations are healed, the curse is removed, and the triune God, Father, Son, and Spirit, is the center, the light, the temple, life. Not supplemented, not assisted, not enhanced. The fullness of God, revealed, present, eternal. The doctrine of the Trinity is not speculation, it is the map of reality. The Father, who is God, loves the Son, who is God, in the unity of the Spirit, who is God. Three persons, one being, not three gods cooperating, one God existing eternally in perfect relationship. And this God created the universe not because he needed it, but because love overflows. He redeemed it not because he was obligated, but because love pursues. He will consummate it not because it benefits him, because love completes what it begins.
Every altar, in every courtyard, in every generation, is an attempt to add something to this love, as if it were insufficient. Every supplement, political, emotional, intellectual, cultural, ideological, is a claim that the triune God requires assistance to be effective in the current crisis. And every generation that tolerates the supplement discovers within 3 generations that the supplement has become the center, and the God they claim to serve is now unrecognizable. The Valley of Hinnom is still there. You can visit it, walk through it, stand where the altars stood. The silence is now geographic, not just liturgical. No sacrifices, no drums, no fire. The place where kings believed they could secure the future by burning their children is now a place where children play in a park. The reversal is complete. The valley meant to guarantee life by offering death now hosts life without requiring death. And the name of that valley, compressed into a single word, is used by Jesus to describe the consequence of trusting supplements instead of God. But the valley is not the final word. The city is. And the city has no temple, because God himself is there, and the light of the city is the Lamb, and the river of life flows from the throne, and the tree that was lost in Eden is restored in the New Jerusalem, and its leaves heal the nations, and the curse is gone, and the servants of God will see his face. This is not poetry, this is destination. The Trinity is not a doctrine to be understood. It is the reality into which believers are invited. The Father loves the Son, the Spirit glorifies the Son, the Son brings people to the Father, and in that eternal relationship, there is no room for altars in the courtyard, because the courtyard itself is gone. The presence is direct, the love is unmediated, the fullness is complete. What is your Asherah pole? The thing you replanted after the last crisis convinced you to cut it down. The thing you know is not God but functions as if it were. The supplement you return to when trusting God alone feels insufficient. The altar you maintain in the courtyard because removing it entirely feels too risky, too absolute, too dependent on a God you believe in but do not fully trust to be enough. Name it now, and you will see it for what it is. Not a helper but a replacement. Not an addition but a rival. Not a supplement but a substitute that within 3 generations will consume everything you built it to protect. The Valley of Hinnom could not be reformed away. It was desecrated twice and reopened twice because the logic of the supplement was never destroyed, only paused. The Trinity destroys the logic. God is already 3 persons in perfect unity. The Son does not supplement the Father. The Spirit does not add to the Son. They are one God, eternally complete, infinitely sufficient. And the moment you see this, not as doctrine but as reality, the altar in your courtyard is exposed as the insult it has always been. Cut it down. Not next week, not after the current crisis passes. Now. Because the pattern is not unique to ancient kings. It is in you. The supplement you are protecting will not protect you. It will, within the span of your children or your children's children, replace the God you claimed to serve. And when it does, the valley will have your name on it, and the word Gehenna will be more than metaphor. But if you cut it down now, if you trust that the triune God is sufficient, that the Father's love does not need your political maneuvering to be effective, that the Son's atonement does not need your emotional intensity to be complete, that the Spirit's presence does not need your intellectual credibility to be powerful, then you will discover what Hezekiah discovered, and Josiah discovered, and every generation that has ever trusted God alone has discovered. The triune God is enough. Not because he meets your expectations, because he is God, and you are not. And the relationship he offers is not improved by your additions. Share this with someone who needs to see it. Subscribe,
There is more coming you will not want to miss. The altar in the courtyard is not always made of stone. Sometimes it is made of time, of reputation, of comfort, of control. Sometimes it is the thing you will not surrender because surrendering it feels like death. And sometimes it is. But the death it requires is not the death of burning children in the valley of Hinnom. It is the death of the ego that believes it can improve on God by supplementing him with something God did not provide. The valley is still there. The altars are not. The silence is permanent. And in the place where the fire once consumed what was most precious to parents who believed they were securing their future, there is now a park where children play. The reversal is not metaphor. It is history. The valley of death is now a place of life. Not because the valley changed, because the God who judged the valley is the same God who redeemed it, and the judgment and the redemption are both works of the Trinity, the Father commanding, the Son accomplishing, the Spirit applying. And in that valley, to this day, no altar stands. The ground is defiled still in memory, sacred in silence, waiting for the city that will come down from heaven, when the new Jerusalem descends, and the dwelling place of God is with man, and the throne of God and of the Lamb is in the city. And there is no need for the sun, because the glory of God gives it light, and the Lamb is its lamp.